This morning, I think we talked about identity. I'll talk a bit more about civil registration. About 4 years ago, I was at this civil registration conference in Addis Ababa. And that was my first international conference on CRVS, civil registration and vital statistics. And there was a long discussion in the room. At one point, I said that we cannot think like statisticians, because I felt that we were all thinking about statistics and not talking about individual persons, individuals. Little did I know that the whole room was full of statisticians, and I was probably the only non-statistician. But having said that, the identity discussion that we had this morning focused on service delivery. So we want to know the identity of a person because we want to deliver a particular service to that person from the government's perspective. The civil registration discussion focuses more on rights. So the right of a person to have a civil identity. It comes from that angle. And there is the SDG discussion that talks about legal identity for all, including birth registration, talks about birth registration. These are the three kind of perspectives that we have, but what is the purpose of these perspectives? And if you look at citizens' perspective, they don't really care what perspective you're talking about, right? So they are born. And even before they are born, the mother knows about the child, right? And so is the health worker. The health worker also knows about a child is coming. Then the child is born, and there is the question of birth registration. Then there is the question of immunization, again by the health worker. Then there is the question of enrollment. And different things also happen between the birth, immunization, and enrollment, perhaps. Exams of different kinds during the school. The child is no longer a child, becomes a voter at age 18 in Bangladesh, possibly in most countries, and then gets married to another citizen. So there is the concept of marriage registration. There is migration happening within the country and possibly outside of the country. And then there's death. Hopefully not right after migration. I mean, maybe there is some time between migration and death. But if you look at the perspective of the government agencies, so health is from the birth to death. Education is somewhere in the middle. Then there is social safety net services, of which we have a large component in Bangladesh. About 12% of our national budget goes into social safety nets. Then there is voter ID. And there is all kinds of civil registration that CRVS folks are concerned with, the statisticians in the room in Addis Ababa. Problems in Bangladesh that we face, some citizens don't have any identity whatsoever. Some have multiple identities, on purpose, sometimes without any purpose. Databases that are not connected creates all sorts of problems. This idea of TCV, we call it time, cost, and visit. We have benchmarked about 500 services that the government provides to citizens along this baseline, time, cost, and visit. National wastage, we calculated that about $100 million are spent on an average in Bangladesh maintaining IDs of different kinds within the government. And there is little actionable evidence because you don't know who you're really talking about, because some have multiple identities, some have no identities. You don't have a handle on the entire population. This quote from a World Bank report, that if you can link civil registration and ID systems, that would be nirvana, potentially. Let me talk about one innovation, or maybe a set of innovations, that created a large impact in Bangladesh. In 131 years, between 1873 and 2004, we registered about 8% of our population. And in 13 years since then, we registered over 90%. So it was a large jump, almost 100-fold efficiency increase. So exactly what happened there? So we introduced electronic birth registration. We created 4,500 registration centers across the country, which actually use this electronic birth registration. And we had not the government officials doing this task because they didn't have the capacity. So we had entrepreneurs running these centers who were actually selling birth registration along with many other services, such as passports, land records, banking, e-commerce, and so on and so forth. And then we linked birth registration to service delivery. In this case, starting with primary school enrollment, they had to produce a document of birth registration, and we linked it with many other services since then. So these three things actually created this huge jump in birth registration, but problems still remained. We had duplication because it was not biometrically verified. So I could go in and say I am 6, even though I am 8 during school registration, because I want to lengthen my service years within the government or outside. When I'm 16, I want to register my birth as I'm 18 because I want to get married. I don't want to get married, but my parents want me to get married. Okay, so I could do that. And registration within 45 days, birth registration within 45 days, we had only about 3% conformance. That goes up to about 80% during primary school enrollment because that's linked with service delivery. So we ran this experiment. The numbers are kind of, okay, I'll just explain because I think the Windows and Mac thing happened and they sort of shifted. So we introduced the idea of, actually let me first talk about the numbers, then I'll talk about how this happened. Up until 2015-16 timeframe, you saw that birth registration in this particular sub-district of the country with about 300,000 people, we had about 5% conformance within 45 days of birth registration. It jumped up within 1 year to 34%. And death registration jumped from 0.4% to a 92%. So how did this happen? We created a central coordination unit in our cabinet division, in our cabinet office, so that the different agencies that could work together on birth registration and death registration would come together. We also created a local coordination body in the sub-district that could work on this. And the most important thing is data integration. So the health workers who go from door to door, they know about the birth, they do the immunization. So they collect the data, and they send this data electronically to the local registrar. So here, we had 2 different departments of the government working together, which had never been done before. So just by making health department and the local government department, which does birth registration, work together and sharing data, we actually have this huge jump in conformance. And obviously we had to have coordination for this to happen at the central level with secretaries, permanent secretaries, and also at the local level. I'll skip this slide. I think this is a bit busy. So, I mean, the idea here is that we had many departments of the government work together to develop an enterprise architecture supported by Bloomberg Philanthropy and Vital Strategies. The technical architecture, talk about a little bit here. So we are trying to connect birth and death registration along with our national ID, which is maintained by our election commission. We're also trying to connect education enrollment. It happens in 2 different ministries, the primary education ministry and the secondary and higher education ministry. And then we're also trying to collect with our health records. They all exist independently in silos in electronic forms, but they're not connected. So the idea is to connect national ID in the election commission and the birth registration to create this idea of unique ID that India has done to some extent, but they have not connected with their birth registration. So our attempt right now is to connect it with our birth registration. So that'll collect all citizens into this one database. And then the migration in, the people who are coming into Bangladesh will also be connected to this. That hasn't happened yet. So that'll give us this concept of CRVS Plus in Bangladesh. We are making this the basis for integrated service delivery, or ISDP, integrated service delivery platform in Bangladesh. So it consists of a database of all population with unique ID, convergence of all the different ID systems that I talked about with one ID. It's a 10-digit random number. A central authentication mechanism. Right now we're using the one that is created by our election commission, which has 10 fingerprints and iris. We've been talking to many companies and organizations that are doing research. Like I was just talking to Element, who's doing research on biometric for infants and children. So whether we could actually start using that to some extent. A set of technical standards. We introduced something called the Citizen Core Data Structure, CCDS, that was authorized by our cabinet for use by all government agencies. So that's one standard for all ID within the government. We're trying to get our private sector to use that as well. A platform that connects to all different registrars, the different service delivery agencies, and the statistical offices. We have multiple. We have one NSO, one National Statistics Office, but we have multiple statistics offices in the country. And then some kind of meaningful data visualization. We started with health, again with the help of vital strategies, so that a lot of this data actually starts making meaningful sense for policymakers. So once this is done, and we are somewhere in the middle right now, this will become the service delivery foundation for all different agencies within the government. Recently, we've started working with Plan International on Open CRVS. And the idea is to create an open source platform for different types of ID and service delivery platform. So it's going to be freely available. Open CRVS will come sometime next year, actually March of 2019. It's fully interoperable with many different systems within the government right now. This is sort of an architecture right now. It will connect with OpenSRP, DHIS2, of which we have a very large implementation in Bangladesh in our health department. I'll take maybe one more minute to talk about a few upcoming innovations in Bangladesh. We're trying to see if we can merge triple identification into one. So there is the biometric identification, which is the national ID right now, which is becoming our unique ID. A financial ID of every citizen. Whether we can assign that at birth, we don't know, but we'd like to do that. Right now we have combined, we're in the process of combining about 140 different types of social safety net programs, interoperable through different types of financial mechanisms, but it'll be one ID there. And a communication ID. It could be the mobile phone number, but in future, if there is no mobile number, if it's Facebook or something else, we may actually use that. So these are the three different IDs that we're looking at to create a merged ID for every citizen. We're looking at blockchain. I heard a lot of discussion this morning from blockchain promoters. So maybe we could adopt some of those. And a very ambitious platform on mobile phone on smartphones for the illiterate. We call it Shathi company, which will actually provide financial inclusion services, education, agriculture services. We just have an alpha of this platform right now, but that will also link to some kind of a merged ID that every citizen, mostly illiterate, will be able to use to get different types of services. To elevate the importance of civil registration to the highest level of policy making in the government, we are trying to link this with SDGs. So everybody understands SDGs. So our Prime Minister understands SDGs. All our ministers understand SDG, but they don't understand civil registration. They don't understand identity. So we're linking the concept of identity and civil registration to many aspects of SDGs to elevate the importance of it. And lastly, different kinds of collaboration. So the political vision combining with the bureaucracy, that's a must-have that we have seen. We've tried to create Well, we have created it. It took us about 6 years to create a national CRVS secretariat at the cabinet. We have about 18 permanent secretaries working there to align their vision towards one single identity. The whole of government effort, I've talked about several instances of that. That gives us better resource utilization and then wider ownership. And we're learning from different countries who are doing different kinds of experiments and implementation on ID and civil registration. So we're at a point where we can share what we have learned with other countries as well, because that's cheaper and smarter. Thank you very much.